The Borzoi is frequently insulted for its long snout and curved silhouette. But it is a noble dog, bred by Russian nobility and slaughtered en masse at the start of the bloody Bolshevik Revolution. Let's learn more about the dog of the Romanovs, the Russian Borzoi. The Borzoi, also known as the Russian Wolfhound, was first bred during the reign of Ivan the Terrible in the 15th century. Since then, the dog has become an important part of Russian culture and history, associated with the grandeur of Imperial Russia and its losses. You can learn more about the Romanovs and Imperial Russia in their videos on this channel. The Borzoi were popular with the royal family, who used them to hunt. Photographs of Nicholas II hunting deer have survived, with his wife alongside him. The theory of whether Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna kept a pistol with her, a gift from her father, until her exile remains a mystery. Peter II had around 400 Borzois, which he used to hunt hares, foxes, and wolves. Alexander II gave Borzoi puppies as gifts to his friends, including Prince Charles of Prussia and the Prince of Wales. Gifting dogs remains a tradition in Russia, with Vladimir Putin accepting dogs as gifts from various heads of state. Borzoi is the masculine singular word of an archaic Russian adjective that means fast. The Borzoi originated in 16th century Russia by crossing Saluki and European sighthounds with thick-coated Russian shepherd breeds. Other Russian sighthound breeds are Stepnaya Borzaya from the steppe called Stepnoi and Krimskaya Borzaya from the Crimea called Krimskoy. Grand Duke Nicholas Romanoff became interested in restoring these bloodlines in the late 1800s. Grand Duke Nicholas Romanov, a cousin of the last Tsar, founded an estate for Borzois in the Tula region of Russia in 1887. Known as Perchino, more than 130 Borzois lived among a total of 400 dogs on the property until it was closed in 1914 and then reduced to rubble. Borzoi were also featured in classic Russian literature. In his 1841 novel, Dubrovsky, poet Alexander Pushkin wrote, "The owner and the guests went to the kennel yard, where more than 500 greyhounds and Borzois lived in contentment and warmth, praising the generosity of Kirill Petrovitch in their dog's language." Was he referring to Perchino? When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the Borzois' connection to the nobility was so strong that many dogs were killed along with their owners. But some Russian nobles who fled the revolution took their dogs with them into exile, and some of today's Russian immigrant families still own Borzois. Irina Korshinova has dedicated 30 years to breeding Borzois at her farm, Rusish, located in the Moscow region town of Golikovo. The Moscow Times spoke with her about the dogs and what they meant to her in 2015. Why did aristocrats love the dogs so much? Irina answered, "Because these dogs and Russian aristocrats are the same. What characterizes Russian aristocracy? Thin hands, delicate facial features. The Borzoi's beauty is similar. First of all, look at its refinement, the delicacy of its complexion. The skin of a Russian Borzoi is very subtle. The hair resembles silk. The posture is a work of art. The aquiline nose, small, almost invisible ears, and the tail in the form of a saber make it look like a piece of art. At first sight, the Borzoi is a fragile creature, but it is a skillful hunter. Do you hunt with dogs as well?" "Yes," Irina said, "I am happy that hunting is still legal in some parts of Russia, and we actively support the traditions of Russian hunting, which include hare and wolf hunting. Every year I travel with around 10 dogs to the Chuvyasha Republic or to Crimea. To go hunting, I take a pack of 3 dogs, 2 females and a male, or a female and 2 males." Have Russian Borzoi breeders managed to keep the lines that originate from the legendary Perchino farm at the beginning of the 20th century? Yes, I have some dogs that originate from the Perchino line. As the revolution came, Russian aristocrats escaped to Europe, bringing dogs to England, Germany, and France. When I worked in Germany in the 1990s, I found the dogs in a Bergland kennel. This one bred dogs from the Perchino lines, and I brought them back to Moscow. Now there are around 2,000 Borzoi dogs in Russia. Back in 1887, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich acquired the Perchino property located west of the city of Tula. Perchino was, at that time, a dilapidated stately home that the Grand Duke endeavored to restore and embellish to make it worthy of becoming the hunting lodge that suited his rank. He created a loop around the front of the property for showing hounds. Kennels were built for greyhounds intended for hunting, and at the same time as rehabilitation, the land previously dispersed was bought as well. The Grand Duke transferred his hunting there in the autumn of 1887. Initially, his team consisted of 60 Borzoi, and the hunt would later reach 130 adult Borzoi. The Perchino property, in addition to being a luxurious hunting lodge, was a breeding farm. Not only dogs were bred, but also horses, cattle, pigs, and poultry. In order to train his hunt, which took place towards the end of the 1880s, His Imperial Highness applied himself to searching in all the renowned kennels of the time for dogs which seemed to him to have the necessary qualities to serve for the regeneration of the old type of the Borzoi. It was a question of regeneration because for many years the old type of the Borzoi had been so completely lost that in order to get an accurate idea of it, the Grand Duke resorted to the accounts and descriptions given by veterans of the Borzoi hunt, who in their youth had known these dogs and hunted with them. This is from Artem Boldarev's The General Appearance of the Borzoi from 1911. In 1889, the Society for the Improvement of the Field Qualities of Hunting Dogs was founded in St. Petersburg under the presidency of the Grand Duke. The company organized speed and aggression tests for all greyhounds, which were then raced. The Grand Duke supported this activity and participated in events with his own greyhounds, just as he participated in hunting dog shows in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He also participated them abroad as a sort of ambassador for Russia in Kruft, London, 1892, and Paris in 1895. In Hunting and Fishing, we can read this anecdote. 1912, organized by the Moscow Hunting Society, 13th Moscow International Dog Show, 83 Borzoi including animals from the Perchino breed. The Grand Duke's Borzois, placed on special benches, festooned in the colors of His Imperial Highness, with the servants in uniform, formed another highlight of the show, attracting a crowd of visitors. Perchino would not have sent his very first subjects, whose existence is too precious to expose them to the risks always possible in a dog show. At Perchino, the adult Borzoi, not taking into account kennels dedicated to mothers and puppies, were divided into 9 kennels. The dogs were organized according to their coats. Tsar Nicholas II preferred short-hair Borzoi. The colors range from dark brindle to white. There were rarely black Borzoi at Perchino. The dogs that make up the hunters' leashes were divided into 8 groups, some each housed in a separate kennel. 2 hunters and a kennel boy, in charge of the care of the dogs of the group, lived in a house adjoining the kennel, so the Grand Duke provided housing for his employees. Thus they have their pupils constantly before their eyes, a precaution which is not superfluous given the combative character of certain dogs. All these kennels were in direct communication with a vast grassy courtyard surrounded by a wire gate, where the different groups were introduced in turn and played under the watchful eye of the staff for 2 hours daily. Dogs were classified into groups according to the color of their coats. At some distance from the 8 kennels was situated that where the Borzoi of His Imperial Highness's private leash was installed. It was divided into two parts, one for dogs and the other for female dogs. The leash was made up of nearly 30 dogs, personally chosen by the Grand Duke from among the best specimens of hunting. These dogs came from almost all groups. All coats were represented, including brown, gray, white with yellow spots, and so on. Yet there was always at least 3 of them with such a coat, which enabled His Highness to keep on a leash at the time of the hunt dogs of the same color. This is the supreme elegance of the Borzoi hunter, but to which, alas, very few modern hunters can aspire. Apart from the Borzoi, the Grand Duke owned a few branded specimens of English greyhounds, which he liked to compete in hare races. He took them in the same way when hunting, liking to compare the speed of his Borzois with the greyhounds. They were not bred in Perchino. His Highness was content to bring them from England if necessary. According to Artem Boldareff in April 1912, the historical overview of Borzoi hunting. Every year in the autumn, during his stay in Perchino, the Grand Duke drew up a list of matings to be made, always using breeding females that had proven themselves in hunting. The dogs were carefully cared for and kept in condition according to the time of year. They also went hunting alternately. The Grand Duke wanted to own a personal hunt consisting of beautiful, fast, and aggressive Borzoi. Perchino's hunts were well known and established, even with a printed brochure available for people to purchase available puppies, and so it's a shame to see the omission of these events from the Grand Duchess Romanoff's scrapbooks. Perhaps the dog racing was considered sinful by the Empress Alexandra, but one thinks the Grand Duchesses and Prince Alexei would have loved to spend time in the country surrounded by this noble breed. Perchino received annually a considerable influx of Borzoi enthusiasts who came to attend the public sales in May, as well as the preliminary public races of Russian greyhounds. So the common rumor today that Borzois were limited to the nobility and you couldn't buy a Borzoi is totally false, and it continues the trend of falsehoods about Imperial Russia, as well as the dissolution of Imperial Russian history, which is a real shame because there's so much to love about Imperial Russia. It is only natural that an important breeding farm like that of Perchino sold what it did not wish to keep. This is done in all breeding, even when the dogs belong to crowned heads such as the late Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, or Grand Duke Nicholas, and this is according to Sodom Camp in January 1904. By 1908, we see Borzoi in rural Oregon hunting coyote. A letter on the letterhead of the Department of Land Management and Hunting of Perchino of His Imperial Highness Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, addressed to a Mr. Cassius of France, is as follows. In reply to your letter, I have the honor to inform you that if you wish to have photos of the dogs, they will cost you 1,000 francs. Since you have a serious intention of buying a dog, it will be much better for you to arrive personally to choose one to your liking. Such a dog that you want to buy will cost you from 5,000 to 10,000 francs. Accept, sir, the assurance of my devotion, the manager of the property. The Grand Duke had an indescribable intuition that allowed him to guess a good breeder in a dog that anyone else might consider mediocre, what is referred to as innate aristocracy. He knew how to surround himself with competent men, a hope for all powerful men, including Vance and Trump, and the Grand Duke did so with Kennel Director General Dmitry Waltzoff, a breeder himself. It should be noted that, unlike other breeders, the Grand Duke did not try to create his own insular family. There was no real Perchino type. He was a collector of all Borzoi, dedicated to continuing its line, and he was able to bring together the best dogs from the best bloodlines to ensure its survival. The Borzois of Perchino, descendants of ancestors with different types, naturally presented not a single type but several, inheriting their appearance sometimes from one ancestral lineage, sometimes from another, and this was not to displease the breeder. Unlike the majority of Russian hunters who wanted above all to form a team of Borzois created on the same mold, Grand Duke Nicholas appreciated all good types and kept them in his breeding, applying himself himself only to improving them. From the Greyhound Rubric, February 1923. Perchino's fame quickly spread beyond the borders of Russia. Some breeders or dog lovers of the time wanted to see Perchino. Thus, the Thomas brothers of O Valley Farm made the trip from the United States in 1903 and then again in 1904 and 1911. Dr. Arthur Wegener from Germany traveled in 1906 and 1913 to see the estate, and Mr. G. von Moylem from Belgium in 1907, and Mr. Alexander Perchino from France twice in 1913. Borzoi were also bought by Serbs and Romanians in this time as well. All of them returned enthusiastic about what they had seen and wrote about it in gazettes or books, except for Mr. von Moylem, who wasn't impressed. From the end of the 1800s, Perchino, or Borzoi from the Perchino kennel, were imported to many countries. Some imports were major in their later influence, including the Bistri Perchino of America and the Petichka Perchino of Germany. But in 1913, the page in the history of the Borzoi was about to close in a way. In 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, the Grand Duke was appointed Generalissimo of the Russian land and sea armies. He was relieved of his duties in August 1915 and then took command of the Caucasus Army. Then he took refuge with his relatives and his property in the Crimea in March 1917. And he finally left for exile in March 1919. There is no documentation on the Borzoi in this period, but it can be assumed that the Grand Duke, at this crucial period in Russian history, had little time to continue to indulge his passion for hunting and Borzoi, and to supervise the management of Perchino. However, we know Perchino continued to exist until 1917. Per Andras Kozlov, the Perchino hunt existed until about the end of 1917. The archives of Perchino specify on March 13, 1917, 175 greyhounds, 95 adult Borzoi, 80 puppies, and 5 greyhounds, to which are added the hounds, harriers with puppies, for a total of 282 dogs existed on the estate. However, in 1917, the ability to feed the dogs became difficult, as there were huge efforts to support the war effort, a globalist war. In addition, the dogs could no longer be used for hunting and were rarely trained. Some Borzoi ended up escaping and became mascots of various military regiments for a time. In the course of 1917, all the dogs were sold or donated. In late October, the Perchino hunt was officially declared liquidated by the decree on the land. In December 1917, the hunt had only one dog. In the 1920s, the Perchino property was home to the state sables as the Soviet government seized private property. However, the Perchino Palace, with the hunting trophies as well as furniture, crockery, paintings, and illustrations of hunting scenes, was preserved. In 1919, the palace became the Museum of Hunting and the Life of Hunters. But in 1926, the museum was closed, and the objects it contained were not transferred to Grand Duke's family, but to the Museum of Art and History in the city of Tula. Then the building was abandoned. Subsequently, authorities ordered it to be dismantled in order to recover the bricks, and the pieces of unsalvageable walls were thrown into the river. Today, all that remains of Perchino are the foundations covered with earth. Perchino, the name of Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich Romanov, have remained linked in the history of the Borzoi to its prestigious aura, and Perchino Borzoi are still present in many of the distant ancestors of a large portion of today's Borzoi. We know that the Perchino pack at its peak had 100 hounds, 130 Borzoi in hunting condition, 15 greyhounds, 20 Borzoi in hunting condition, 100 puppies annually, and 87 horses, saddle and carriage horses, 78 employees. There is a letter in the Perchino archive dated September 1917, which was written and signed by D. Valtsov. This letter was sent to the Food Committee of the Alexinsk district. Voltsov writes that 10 workers of the Perchino hunt, together with their family members, a total of 53 people, don't have the possibility of growing vegetables anymore, and they are threatened with starvation. This was, of course, a common outcome with World War I and many blockades on Russia. Voltsov was inquiring about the possibility of bread. This was the situation even in Perchino, a wealthy country estate. Therefore, it is not surprising that by 1917 most of the large hunt with Borzois were killed, as Russians themselves were being starved and blockaded to death by Zionist Bolsheviks. The path of the Borzoi is very important to study because we can see the absolute thorough hatred that Zionist Bolsheviks had for ordinary living. It is important to understand the pattern of Zionist Bolshevikism, how hospitals and critical resources like gardens are often attacked before invasions and food blockades and war, to prevent the existence of an entire race, in this case the Borzoi. You can see these tactics again and again in the siege of Haifa, Palestine a few months ago, as well as Beirut, Lebanon, and the attacks on it this year by Shitzriel. In Perchino's diary for 1917, all the names of the Borzois were indicated, to whom they were sold, to whom they were donated, and which dogs were killed. According to the diary and a bulletin on the state of the Perchino hunt, in January 1917, 147 Borzois lived in Perchino kennel. That year, rye bread disappeared from the diets of the dogs, and the supply of white bread was stopped. A few months later, the staples were scarce, including millet, oatmeal, milk, and horse meat. Records of dispensed products for dogs ceased to exist by August 1917, indicating their deaths, and hunting trips were not carried out. After the reduction of food staples, 6 Borzoi males were destroyed, and this is all according to the great resource Borzoipedia. There was a gradual sale of Borzois and hounds. Dogs were first sold one at a time and then sold in large groups. 36 dogs given away in April. 24 Borzoi puppies given away, received by Joseph Iveskevich. 12 Borzois given away, received by A. Anayev. Borzois were also purchased by Sergei Nikolaevich Techlukev, Alexandra Nikolaevna Chesbaiseva, and other persons. It should be noted that all buyers of Perchino Borzois were Russian citizens. Unfortunately, during this difficult period, not a single Perchino Borzoi was sold to a foreign kennel, which could have ensured continuation of the royal line, yet another parallel to the imperial family, of which the daughters remained unmarried at their deaths. By November 1917, only 18 Borzois, 12 hounds, and 1 greyhound remained in the Perchino. The last entry in the diary is dated December 5th, 1917. By that day, 1 Borzoi female remained in Perchino. She was Uslada VII, and she died that month. Maybe she was this last Borzoi in Perchino, and again the path of the Borzoi reflect the path of the Russian imperial family, since Grand Duchess Anastasia was believed to be the last Romanoff alive at Ekaterinburg. We do see some letters from the Grand Duke during this time. "You understand how hard it is for me," he wrote, "but there is nothing to do. I count on you that you arrange everything soon and well." The Grand Duke wanted to keep a few dozen dogs for himself, especially so as not to lose the breed. So even as they starved and lost their homes, many Russian nobles' view was on the future. The Grand Duke did want to try to telegraph to America about the dogs, but he said he thought nothing will come of it, and they are at war. Maybe they will buy a few and leave them for maintenance. When the dogs were sold to American and French buyers, they retained the Perchino name, and in this way you can trace modern Borzoi back to the Romanoff kennels. According to Romanov historian Igor Zemin, the Tsar maintained a kennel of nearly a dozen English collies, his favorite breed, to accompany him on his daily walks through the Alexander Park at Tsarskoye Selo. Why did the Tsar prefer English collies, a familiar breed to his wife to the Russian Borzoi? And was this indicative of his preference for his wife's tastes rather than his own? The Tsar's two favorite dogs were Raven and Iman. Raven was presented to Nicholas when he was 17 years old, and it became his constant companion during his long daily walks. He embarked on a journey to Egypt, India, and the Far East from 1890 through 1891, during which Raven was left behind in the care of his parents. His father, Emperor Alexander III, regularly reported in letters about Raven, with whom the emperor walked in the garden of the Anichkov Palace in St. Petersburg. In late October 1890, Empress Maria Fyodorova, whom you can learn about on this channel, wrote to her son, Ella was waiting for us to go for a walk, and poor Raven came too. He now spends a lot of time with me and seems to like my room, for he lies quietly at my feet, and we try to console each other. In January 1891, Emperor Alexander III, whose voice you can listen to on this channel, wrote to his son, Raven is getting fat because stupid people continue to feed him all day long so that he is no longer a dog, but a barrel. Naturally, the overly pampered dog became ill and due to age. After the death of his father on the 1st of November 1894, Tsar Nicholas ascended the throne. Less than a year later, his beloved dog Raven died in September 1895. Following the tradition of his Romanoff predecessors who buried their faithful canine companions, Nicholas II created a small cemetery for his dogs on the Children's Island, situated near the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, which remains closed to the public. A granite obelisk was erected over Raven's grave, upon which the dates of his birth and death were engraved. We know Tsar Nicholas II's daughters, the Grand Duchesses, also spent time on Children's Island. The emperor's personal mourning for Raven lasted about 2 months. In December 1895, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorova, whom you can learn about on this channel as Grand Duchess Ella, presented the Tsar with a collie puppy. The Tsar wrote, Ella gave me a wonderful collie, similar to Raven. In 1905, the imperial family moved from the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. This palace is surrounded by a beautiful, well-groomed park, which was an excellent place for the dogs. The personal dogs of the imperial family were traditionally kept at the expense of the ministry of the imperial court. Since there were a lot of dogs, the so-called dog's kitchen was arranged for them directly in the basement of the Alexander Palace. They were fed a diet of oatmeal, milk, and meat, and all products had to be fresh. The Tsar was always accompanied by his collies on his walks through the vast Alexander Park. According to the memoirs of Anna Vyrabova, there were 11 dogs. A special dog house was built for them next to the Alexander Palace, perhaps reflecting the teachings of Grand Duke Nicholas's kennels. They were strictly forbidden to go inside the palace themselves. As the maid of honor Sophie Buxhoveden observed, after drinking a glass of tea, smoking a cigarette, the Tsar went out into the park for a short walk with his favorite purebred dogs. There were other dogs associated with the imperial family too. In 1906, by order of the palace commandant D.F. Trepov, who was responsible for the security and safety of the imperial family, a kennel for guard dogs was set up near the Alexander Palace in the village of Alexandrovka, but it doesn't seem that these dogs were Borzoi. Later, a similar kennel was organized in Peterhof. These kennel dogs were bred and trained to guard the perimeter of the Alexander Park and Tsarskoye Selo and other suburban imperial residences. So it raises questions as to how the Bolshevik Guard was able to place the imperial family under house arrest if they had all of these dogs guarding them. Was there a small coup in the kennels? All of the dogs associated intimately with the imperial family seem to be English collies, not Borzoi. However, we know the Tsar thought highly enough of the Borzoi to give them as royal gifts, for example, the gift of the dog Vasilika to Queen Alexandra. Queen Alexandra became well known as a breeder of Borzoi, with Vasilika one of her most successful dogs. He achieved champion status and won over 75 prizes in his lifetime. A fine silver model of the pup was commissioned by King Edward VII and completed by Fabergé in 1907.